Angular Orange here with a tutorial on the HTTP client. Okay, the HTTP client is used for accessing REST web services. It's the HTTP client module in addition to the HTTP client object which you use inside your application. The HTTP client is used for making the HTTP request and process responses, and that's built on top of the XML HTTP request interface. There's certain benefits for using it: testability, strong typing of the request and responses via typed objects. There's these interceptors you could use to process requests and responses, and there's better error handling via APIs based on observables. And the methods supported are get for doing a read, an HTTP post for doing a create. And when I say read and create, I'm talking about read a JSON object, create a JSON object. The put does an update and replace of JSON data. And you could delete data using the delete, and you could patch, do an update and modify. And you can also get the headers in the response using the interface. And there's also a couple of things which I don't want to get into too much detail. One is a CORS. There's support for CORS, a cross-origin request within HTTP client, and it comes in the form of protecting your application from cross-origin request, and also helps you enables you to make cross-origin requests. So I don't want to get too much into that. We'll do that in our course. I do want to point out that the HTTP client module, as well as the HTTP client, was new as of Angular 4.3. I have installed Angular 4.4 on my system. My projects are now being created with Angular 4.4, and I did it because I want this HTTP client object. The previous HTTP object in Angular 2 and Angular 4.2, the HTTP object, we made web requests with observable responses. Excuse me. However, I had problems. Although I did filters and maps and aggregations, and I managed to do what I needed to do on the front end in retrieving my data and interrogating my data, I found it pretty confusing at times with response data. How do I get it? What is the structure, the underlying structure? With the HTTP client, your JSON data is being converted into an object. And that object type by default is not necessarily known. The interface is not known, but you could use data types to make sure that you understand the body of your response or the complete response, and you know how to handle it. Okay, so how do you install the HTTP client? You do an npm install -g at Angular/CLI at latest. And that will upgrade your CLI and upgrade your Angular projects so that you have support for HTTP client. So once I did this, I went into my WebStorm development environment, and I noticed my TypeScript was updated to 2.3. My node, I don't know if my node was updated, but it was still 6.10 at least. And if I go into the project after I create the project with WebStorm and do an ng-v, I will see the version that's used within my project. And I was happy to see that it's all 1.4.4, and I'm using Node 6, and I'm using TypeScript 2.2. To my surprise, when I went into my WebStorm environment, those configuration parameters of the settings and everything were pointing to these new values. So I think that's good news until I find out I have a problem with one of my projects in my previous 4.2 version, but I don't think I will. Okay, so that's how you update your Angular, your node module so you support the new version of Angular, and this is how you create a new project which will support the HTTP client. Okay, so the first thing you do is, this is what I did, and I'll teach it the way I did it. I went into my app module and I imported HttpClientModule. And then in my annotation for ng module, in my app module, I actually imported the HttpClientModule as well. Okay, so there's two changes that have to be done in the app module.typescript file. And you do that, and then you go to your app component and you import HTTP client. Now notice both the HTTP client module and the HTTP client are coming from @angular/common/HTTP. Okay, once you do this, you can inject the HTTP client into your constructor. So basically what I do is I do a private HTTP : and I use the HTTP client type. And so what this does is it injects an object of type HTTP into my app component, and the keyword private says implicitly create a private variable called HTTP in my class app component instance. Okay, so upon constructing my app component class, I get an app component instance, and that instance has an HTTP attribute, which is of type HTTP client. And so in my ng on init function, I do a http.get on the URL, and I subscribe to that. Now, the http.get on my URL, which I've defined to be this HTTP client data.json file, which I put on the cloud on my website, is something I'm doing a get on. And so when I subscribe, I get the data, I log the data. Now the data is coming back. The JSON object is going to be converted into an object. The JSON data is going to be converted to an object, and that data gets logged. You'll see it's an object, and you could go into the console and point and click and see what kind of data is inside of there. But TypeScript doesn't really know what type of data, what is the interface of that data. So if you do a data.name or something like that, you'll get a TypeScript error. One thing I just noticed here is I must have did this quickly. The ng on init function, the on init must be implemented in the app component, which is missing over here. So I'll put that in. Okay, so that's how you use it. It's the simplest form of using it. Notice I used the this.http, and the HTTP is not explicitly defined in my app component. It's that private keyword and TypeScript that implicitly put that HTTP in my object. And since this method is part of the object and the HTTP is private, this method could still access it. Okay, so if I hit on my URL in the browser, I'll see this data. And this is my data. I typed it in. I put it out there. I called it HTTP client data. I put it on their JSON bucket on my Amazon S3 cloud. Under my website, I made it publicly accessible, and this way my gets and my sample code will access it appropriately. Now, I want you to note that the HTTP client parses the response into an object. And so you could log the object. You'll see object in the console, and if you point and click, you might be able to see the data. You could also do a data in left square bracket, right square bracket to access the field name in the data. You could also do a JSON stringify on the response data. But if you try in your TypeScript code to do a data.name, you'll get an error. The TypeScript doesn't know the type. So I just want to point that out. Okay. And the reason why I'm pointing that out is because we want to use response types. We want to define an interface called data response with a name, address, and phone attribute. Define the types of those attributes. And when we point to the URL and we do an HTTP GET, we say that the response is going to be of this type, data response. And so the get on the URL for this data response typed object. Okay, so when you do that and you subscribe, we use the fat arrow operator to get the response data. And in that case, we can do a data.name, data.address, data.phone, and log that because we know what the type is, and TypeScript will not give us a compile error. So response types are important. It makes it easy for us to use our data. Okay, and also if there's an error in the HTTP call or something, we'll go into the error block and we can log the error occurred as this. So you have two parts of your subscribe that you need to deal with, the successful and the failure. And I just want to point that out. You will be dealing with issues in those blocks. Okay. So we want to note that if you want more than just a response body, such as special headers or status codes, you can tell the HTTP client you want full response instead of just the body using the observe option. And the way you do that is you do an HTTP get. You say my response is going to be my JSON response data type. And you're making a call on the URL, but you're also adding this other parameter using the observe option on the response. And in that case, you get a response, a full response, and you could do a .body.name, .body.address, .body.phone, or you could just do a response.headers.get a header. So you would be able to read your complete response and respond appropriately. Note, RSP is of type HTTP response, my JSON response type. Okay, so and going back to the previous example with error handling, we had a get with a data response, and we subscribed to it, and we were capable of using a dot notation and displaying the data. And we could also take that data response, that data, and put it in an interface result. My interface result could be of type data response, or it could be of type any, but I'm putting the data response data into my interface results. And I'll show you that in the code because I make multiple calls with my get and handle it in different types of ways using different data types and responses and error handling. So I just wanted to point out that it's easy to just save the data response typed object into an attribute in your component. Okay, now also the important thing I wanted to show you here is the possibility of using a typed error response. And so I have a typed error response, HTTP error response. I have to make sure I import it in the code and I use it in my whatever file needs it, has it. And then in processing this get method, I could use an error as an instance of error. If so, it's a client error, else it's a server error. I could use JSON.stringify to log it, or I could just say, oh, my error does have a message attribute. Let me just log the error message attribute. Now, if you're trying to take some of the data from the error response and display it on the front end, you might find you might have a problem, and it could be associated with the fat arrow operator, the asynchronous nature of the application code. But don't fear, you won't be there for a while because I might want to show the error response on the front end, or even this error.message. But typically, you want good practice. You'd put a user-friendly message on the front end. So if there's an error, you could do something else which won't involve the error data. But anyway, okay. So let's move on. Okay, so there's this retry option, and you could do a get on your HTTP client typed HTTP attribute. And basically when you do a get on a URL, you could do a .retry, let's say with an option of 3, and it could retry 3 times if there's a failure. On the 4th time, it goes into the subscribe block. So let's say your server's down and someone's rebooting it. It'll retry once, retry twice, retry 3 times, and then it would go into the subscribe block. You'll either see an error saying that you got a server error, you get a 404 error, or you'll see that you're successfully executing. You'll see that the log of your data name has appeared or whatever. And also you can process text data. You could pass into the get function an additional JSON object which says the response type. In this case, I'm saying response type is text. So I get back data that's text, and I could log it. The observable returned by the get is of type observable string, because a text response was specified. There's no need to pass a string type parameter to the get. Okay, we're going to look at a client example, which I called HttpClient, and we're going to go through the code right now. First, I did run npm start on my HttpClient object. Maybe I'm jumping the gun. Let's go to the code. And first, let me show you what I did. I used WebStorm to create a project, new project. I went into Angular CLI, and I created the new project. I called it HttpClient. I hit create. I'm not going to do that because it takes a long time to create the node modules, etc. And I got this project. It generated all the resources for the project. So let's go and look. Let me go into presentation mode here for a minute. And let's go look at the application code. Okay. First, I want to take a look at the Angular CLI JSON file. I have an index.html and I have a styles.css file associated with it down here. So, and then I have a main.typescript driver file. And those are the 3 files I look at. So the first thing I look at is index.html. There's a custom app tag here called app-root. That must be my root component selector. So I have an Angular application here, and the user interacts with the real estate that the Angular application takes in this body tag governed by this app-root component. Okay, and then I have a style sheet which has nothing in it. And I have a main.ts driver, which basically has several imports. It has enabled prod mode. It has a platform browser dynamic. The platform browser dynamic is used to bootstrap the app module. Now, and of course, I have my custom app module. Every Angular application has an app module. I have it in my app.module file up here, and I have an environment which might be pointing to configuration information. Like my URL really should be in my environment file, but I forgot to put it there. And there's also a catch here for an error when you're bootstrapping the app module. Now, we're using 4.4 now, so some new things started happening. First of all, when the application fires up, the main.ts drives the app module gets bootstrapped, the root component gets bootstrapped in the app module. Let's take a look at that. The app module uses the HttpClientModule. We import the HttpClientModule, and notice we're bootstrapping an app component. This is my root component to my UI component tree. So I know that that root component gets instantiated. That selector tag of that app component must be app-root, because that's what Angular CLI generates by default in my components when it first generates the app component. and so I know what I'm kind of dealing with setting up and loading my HttpClient module and my and the first steps in the life cycle for the application. So let's go into the next component I should be looking at, which is the app components, which is the root component, and it's my only component. So first of all, let me just jump here really quick. Now let me just jump here really quick. First of all, I wanted to verify that my selector is app-root. So we know that. In my app component here, I've imported the HttpClient to HTTP error response from Angular Common HTTP. It's the same place that I'm importing the HttpClient module from. Okay. So, and I have an external template, I have an external style sheet. And so I look at my app component class, and what do I have here? I have a title. I called it HttpClient tutorial. I have a URL. I'm pointing to my JSON data. I have a result of type any, and usually I don't initialize. I'll go back and try to figure out why I initialize this, but it's probably the way I use the object in the template, the result in the template. For the non-typed call versus the typed call. Yeah, that's what I did. So the first thing we do is we exit. And then we have this interface result. I said type any, and I put some dummy data in there, and I have this error which I call a string. Now here's the important part. I inject the HttpClient into my constructor. I tell TypeScript implicitly define a private variable called HTTP with an instance of that HttpClient object in my app component instance of my class. So now on my ng on a net, oh, this is really interesting. I didn't implement it here, and it still worked. Okay, let me go back and look at that. Usually I implement the on a net, and I believe you would get a compile error on Angular 4.2, but I didn't have to do it 4.4. I like that. I just noticed it. I like it. Anyway, point is that I have this ng on a net, and I do an HTTP get on my URL. My URL is pointing to my JSON data out on the cloud. Okay, so I subscribe to it, I get the data. I show you the response data, I show you the data response name. If I try to reference the data using the dot notation, you will get a TypeScript error. TypeScript, my Angular code doesn't know the type of this data. I'm trying to remember what Angular 1 did. I don't remember having this issue, but it wasn't a strong typed language, so it's good and it's bad. Okay, so anyway, then I log the response, the JSON stringified data. So I show you 3 forms of data that you could log, and then I also put my data object in a result. My result is of type any. Okay, so I don't know if that helped me. I think it did when I put the data in the type any, but then I went back and did this. So I think I still had a problem, even though this had the result was type any, and I was putting this data here because the type of this data it's an object. So you could use your standard object interrogation methods, but as far as using this dot notation. And the dot notation does a get, and you have to have the attribute there with that name, and you have to have the interface. So we'll take a look at that. Okay, so I'm gonna just take a look at that there. I put the result in data. Let's go take a look at the code running. let me see if I could get it to work. Okay, so this is the new interface to the Angular 4.4. It put this welcome string in there, and I changed the string to HttpClient tutorial. It said welcome to app or whatever, and I changed it to HttpClient tutorial. And then it by default generated this template with these links, which is going to go away, but I just wanted to show you it initially. And the results of my ng on init that made the get request is showing the object. Okay, so that's what I got so far that we've discussed. Let's go back and take a look at how that happened. Okay, so I took the data and put it in result. Let's go now look at the template. Okay, I'm not going to go through that right now. Let's go back and look at the template. And so let's talk about a piece of the template. I have an H1, a div tag, an H1 tag. My styles, I do have some styles here. I had to color some things and size some things. So let's look at the template. So I say welcome to, and I use this double curly bracket, which is rendering an expression using the attributes of the component on the back of the backing object. And I just show the title, and my title is it's welcome. It's HttpClient tutorial, and so this text says welcome to HttpClient tutorial, and then this image data was generated automatically. My icon is showing here, so I don't really want to get into that, nor do I know how it's being rendered right now. Let's move on. And then there's this content, which I ID'd as content, and it shows the links. These were automatically generated. If you click on them, it'll open up the documentation for Angular I/O tutorial, Angular CLI, blogs, etc. And then I have the results of the initialization is the following. And I have the result, but then I pipe it through a JSON. So notice the result is showing us a JSON object. But the result is the data coming back. And I've already, the response has already taken the JSON object and mapped it into the JSON data and mapped it into an object. So if I go and remove this pipe, what I'll see in the front end, let's see if the front end re-renders, is that I have an object here. So it's kind of interesting. The truth is, in our component, we do want to deal with an object, but we do want it to be a typed object, so we can process it appropriately. So let's go back here and do this. Okay, and let's go back to the application and look at it again. It re-renders. I see my JSON data. Now this is coming off the cloud. It's my .json object I put on my S3 bucket, JSON bucket under AngularOrange.io, and I have read permissions set for everyone so my code can actually read it. And so now let's look at the second part of our demo. Second part of our demo, what we want to do is take a look at a way to use typed response data. And so what I did was I introduced a button on the front end, and that button, on a click event, I invoke the interface call on the object instance. And in that case, I do an HTTP GET on the same URL using a data response type. And in the data response type, I take the data and I show the data name, data address, data phone, and I take my data and put it in my interface result. If there's an error, I display error messages. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Okay. Okay, I'm displaying dummy data here because if I don't initialize my data response that I'm using, I'll get TypeScript errors in my log file. So let's first go here into the log file and show you what's going on. Wonderful. And let me re-render the application just so we see what's happening in the log file. Okay, so the response data comes back as an object. The response data name is John Doe. And then I did a JSON stringify and I showed the JSON object. And I told you, in the response, in the initialization response of the HTTP GET, since we don't know the data type, if it did a dot name, you'd see an error here. I'm talking about this. If I try to do a dot name, you'll see oh, it didn't even compile. Okay, so that's even better. Okay, so I was thinking about something else, but let's go back and recomment this out. It's for training purposes. You can't do a date if you do a GET that's not typed. This is an object without a known type, so you can interrogate it and you could try to typecast it or whatever. But the proper way to do the HTTP client call is with a data type, and this is a recommended way so you have an object that you could work with. So now using the dot name, you could do it if you invoke this function. So let's go back and take a look and see. Let's first get our application working again. Okay, so now it's back working again. So I go down here, click for user interface, and have result go into a TypeScript object. Click using, I wrote a string here, I can't even read. Click for using the interface. So now I'm doing a GET on the interface to have the result go into a TypeScript object where I know what the type is. And then I could basically do a .name, .address, .phone. Now, like I said, I initialized this all to dummy because I would get an error if I render this without getting the response with the proper type. So let's see, if I make the call, then the call is made and I get the data from the server. And in this case, like I log something a lot simpler, name, address, phone, whatever. Okay, now you could send data, and I didn't do that, but I just want to point out that I do have to define the data response interface with the data, like I showed you, and also everything works just fine when you're using the data types in the GET until you get an error. So let's try an error. How do you do this? Let's do. Over here, I didn't even do any error processing up here. So let's go down here and try this. Instead of the URL, let me just put error here because I know that works. It's incorrect. So let's go back to the code, the front end, and see what happens. Okay, so it looks like it transpiled properly and it got rendered properly, and I see the initialization result properly. Now I'm going to make a call. And what I'm finding is I do get an HTTP 404 that I can't find a URL, but I'm also seeing that I processed my error. I got it. I'm showing you what the error looks like. There's headers, there's a status code, status text, there's a URL, there's a message. And look what my message said. And I basically logged my message here. Error.message, HTTP failure response for this, not found. So this is the way to look at the response and process it to some extent. So now basically what I did here is I took the error and I said it was an HTTP error response. Notice in my imports I had to import that from the common HTTP library as well. I'm calling it a library, it's a package, it's a module, whatever you want to call it. I find the terminology kind of strange in Angular, but we're importing from a module here. That's what I finally want to say. And so the error is typecast as an HTTP error response. And what this interface looks like, go on the web, see what it looks like. I'm looking at the error, I'm looking at the error.message, and then I also, just for my own satisfaction, did a JSON stringify on my error just to see what this thing looks like. And that's when I started logging this thing and seeing what this thing looks like. And then I finally said, oh, yeah, I want something simple. And even this simple error.message is not something I wanted to show the user. But you should probably show the user something. And I got to be quite honest with you, I had trouble with the change detection and setting this, but I think it has to do with the fat arrow operator, the asynchronous nature, and the this pointer inside the fat arrow operator. And the bottom line is you could take the this pointer and say my this pointer, and then probably reference it and show that error on the front end. But I didn't do that yet. Okay, so that's really all I wanted to show. Oh, did I really show you? Yeah, I guess I did show you. Did I show you the detail in the template? Let me go back and show you that. Some of the detail in the response, right? So basically on this interface, I show you the previous interface with the result piping into JSON when you don't, but on the click, basically I introduced a button, and then what I did was I said, okay, when there's an event, left paren event, click is my event type. So you could put any event type here inside this, which corresponds to a button or uses actions. If you can catch it, I'm actually processing that event and invoking interface call. So that's why I say click to make an HTTP call, and when you click that button, I invoke this particular method, and that particular method inside my object makes a call using the data response type and puts the data into the interface result. So now here I do, even though I do a data response name, I do an interface result.name, interface result.data, etc. Now, let me go back and just revisit that for us really quickly. What I did was I did a get, and the response was a data response typed object, and I put that in an interface result, and my interface result is of type any. So the data coming back is of type data response, which is this type, and I put it into an interface result, which is of type any. And I'm not going to touch this code. If you try doing something different, you'll probably get an error because you're rendering that result initially before the object exists of the type. So it's probably my own templating issue. I can't evaluate this when the object call is not made yet. So my template does that, but I can use a star ng if and say, oh, if this is defined, then I could actually do an ng template or whatever and just show my results. So I could go back and change this, but I just wanted to show you a little bit. Now, of course, you could send data, and I'm in the process of showing my sample and sending data, but I'm not going to go through that because I don't want anyone writing to my cloud JSON data yet. So I have to figure out how to allow me to write to that JSON object on my AWS S3 bucket folder, JSON folder, because right now nobody can write anything to my AngularOrange.io, and no one can read many places. The JSON folder, you could read it. The JSON bucket, you could read it. So we're reading it, but I'm not logging into Cognito or user pool or anything here, so I don't want to open this up. But I will extend my example to sending data. So our complete course will have a get, a send, a post. It'll go through HttpClient in great detail, and go through the error handling and the user-defined types in great detail, and also go through all the interceptors and filters in great detail, because we're in the process of updating that data as well. So let me go back to my code example. I don't want to leave this like this, because what did I do? I changed something here. It was my URL. So let me go 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, now I'm back. Let me make sure my application works again. Initialization works. I make the HTTP call, that works, and we're done. Okay, thank you for joining.